The barn stood at the edge of the north field, like an old man who had refused to sit down. Silver boards weathered to the color of a winter sky, held together with square nails that had not been manufactured since Eisenhower was president. The foundation was fieldstone pulled from the creek bed by Elliott Kane's father in 1943, each rock set by hand before the war took him overseas. The barn had survived 6 decades of Montana winters, 2 lightning strikes, and 1 flood that swept everything east of the county road clean off the map. It was still standing, so was Elliott. He was on the porch at 5 in the morning before the sun had cleared the Beartooth Range. The coffee in his ceramic mug was black and hot, the way he had taken it every morning for 50 years. The mug itself was chipped at the rim, a hairline crack running down one side. He had bought it at a county fair in 1987, the summer his nephew Owen was born, and he had never found a reason to replace it. Millstone Valley spread before him in the last of the darkness. 500 acres of dry land corn planted in May tended through a summer that could not make up its mind between drought and flood, and now standing gold and brittle and ready. The stalks rustled in the pre-dawn air with a sound like paper being slowly turned in a quiet room. Elliott knew that sound the way he knew his own breathing. It was the sound of another year surviving. The weather radio in the kitchen had confirmed what his right knee and the behavior of his cattle had already told him 2 days ago. A hailstorm was coming. The National Weather Service put it at 48 hours. Elliott's experience with mountain weather put it closer to 44. He had done the arithmetic more times than he could count. The Apex Titan 9500, it could cover the North Field in 11 hours of continuous operation, the South Field in 9, the Lower Creek parcels in 4 more. 24 hours of work. The West Terraces needed 2 passes because of the grade. Call it 27 hours total. 44 minus 27 was 17. 17 hours of margin if nothing broke, if the trucks kept pace, if nobody got in the way. He did not let himself think about what Nora had done the night before. He thought about the 17 hours. The screen door opened behind him, and his wife came out onto the porch. Nora Kane was 67 years old, and she moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to trust her body's energy reserves from 1 hour to the next. Her hair was thinner than it had been in March when the oncologist in Billings had first used the word chemotherapy in a sentence that also contained her name. She carried a mug of tea and stood beside him without speaking for a long moment, looking out at the same dark field. "You should have called Marsh yourself," she said. Not an accusation, a fact delivered by a woman who had spent 42 years learning the difference. "You called him," Elliott said, "because I knew you would say 3 sentences when you needed to say 10. She took a sip of tea. "He'll be here by 11. He has everything he needs." Elliott looked at her hand on the porch railing. The knuckles were more prominent than they used to be, the skin across them thinner. $34,000. That was the cost of the next treatment cycle, the one scheduled for October. The number lived in the back of his mind the way a stone leaf lives at the bottom of a boot. You stop noticing it until you sit down. "I have the carbon copy," he said. "I know you have the carbon copy." She turned to look at him fully. "Elliott, whatever happens this morning, you do not react. You let Marsh do his job. You let the boys do what they're going to do. You just sit here and you wait." "I know how to wait," he said. "You know how to be stubborn. That is not always the same thing." She picked up her mug and went back inside, and the screen door closed behind her, with a sound like a quiet period at the end of a long sentence. Elliott turned back to the field. A meadowlark somewhere out in the dark corn was beginning its morning song, tentative at first, then gaining confidence as the sky behind the mountains started to separate from purple into gray. He listened to it and drank his coffee and held on to the arithmetic in the 17 hours. He thought about the wire transfer instead of anything else. He had driven to Billings on a Friday 5 days ago and stood at the counter of the First Montana Bank while the teller processed the final balloon payment on the Apex Titan 9500, $142,654.12. Transaction code 5999882CH. Time stamped at 10:14 in the morning. The teller had handed him a printed confirmation and a carbon copy, and Elliott had folded both carefully and placed them in the breast pocket of his work shirt and driven home through the valley in the late afternoon light without saying a word to anyone about it. The original was in the filing cabinet in the parlor. The carbon copy was in a small wooden box on the roll-top desk, the same box that held his father's pocket watch, and a letter from the agricultural department dated 1978 that had never warranted an answer. He had not looked at the carbon copy since he put it there. He did not need to. He had the numbers memorized the same way he had the contour lines of his own land memorized, from the inside. Owen's truck came up the driveway at 6:30 headlights, cutting pale cones through the morning mist. Owen Kane was 25 years old, and he drove with the kind of focused intensity that belongs to young men carrying guilt they have not yet found a way to set down. He came up the porch steps and poured himself a coffee from the pot on the kitchen stove and came back out and stood next to his uncle and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the contract." "Don't," Elliot said. "I'm the one who told you to sign it. I said the machine would pay for itself in 2 seasons. It was going to." Elliot looked at him. Owen had his mother's height and his grandfather's jaw and eyes that carried more than 25 years ought to hold. He had grown up on this land, and the land had done what it does to everyone who stays long enough. It had made him serious in the way that mattered. "The machine is good. The payment was made on time. Whatever comes down the road this morning has nothing to do with your advice." Owen looked at the corn. "If I hadn't pushed you toward the financing in the first place, none of this would be happening. If your grandfather hadn't driven a tractor into the creek in 1961, I wouldn't have learned to fix a hydraulic line by feel, and I wouldn't have been able to keep that same machine running until 1989. Elliot set his hand briefly on Owen's shoulder, one firm pressure, and then gone. "Go check the grain bins. Make sure the augers are clear." Owen set his mug down and went. Elliot watched him cross the yard, moving quickly the way young men move when they have been given a task that lets them stop thinking. There was something else Owen was carrying beyond the guilt about the contract. Elliot could sense the shape of it without being able to name it. He let it go. There was too much else to hold this morning. At 6:47, the GMC 3500 turned off the county road and came down the gravel drive. Elliot heard it before he saw it. A diesel truck hauling a loaded flatbed trailer makes a particular sound, a low, laboring growl overlaid with the rattle of transport chains settling against the deck. He had heard that sound at other farms and at county auctions in the years when things were bad across the valley and men were losing what they had built. He had never expected to hear it at the end of his own driveway. He sat still and watched the truck come in. The GMC was charcoal gray, and it was pulling a flatbed trailer with grade 70 transport chains already laid out across the bed in a pattern that meant the driver had done this enough times that preparation was no longer a conscious step. The truck stopped 20 feet from the porch and the driver's door opened. Preston Harlow was 32 years old. He stepped out with the careful composure of a man performing a role he had spent time rehearsing. His polo shirt carried the Vanguard Apex Industrial logo embroidered in silver thread above his left breast. The shirt fit too precisely across the shoulders and not quite right everywhere else the way clothes fit men who choose them for the impression they make rather than the work they require. His boots were dark brown leather, clean enough to suggest they had met no surface more demanding than a parking garage. He carried a tablet computer, the screen glowing pale blue in the early light. He did not look up from it right away. The passenger door opened and Dale Rutherford stepped out. Dale was 45 years old, thick-necked and broad through the shoulders, with the permanent squint of a man who has spent 2 decades working in weather. He carried a set of heavy-duty lockout tools and a master key fob, and he moved with a quiet efficiency that had nothing to do with performance. Dale had done this job for 20 years. He knew the difference between a clean repo and a dirty one, and he could usually tell within 30 seconds of arriving at a property which kind he was standing in. He walked toward the barn without looking at the house. The deliberateness of that avoidance was itself a kind of looking. Preston came to the base of the porch steps and read from his tablet without raising his eyes. Elliot Kane. Elliot took a sip of his coffee. The silence that followed had weight. Not hostile, not theatrical. Just present the way silence is present on land that belongs to the person holding it. Preston looked up. He had the face of someone who had been told since early in life that confidence and competence were the same thing. "We're here for the Apex Titan 9500. Final balloon payment 90 days past due. Corporate issued the dispatch at midnight." Elliot set his mug on the arm of the rocker. He looked at the corn behind the house. He looked at the sky, still gray but brightening fast over the mountains. He looked at Preston Harlow's clean boots. Then he said, "That payment was made." The shift in Preston's expression was small but legible. The shift of a man who has heard this sentence many times and for whom repetition has long since replaced consideration. "That's what they all say. My screen shows red. Red means I take the keys." He adjusted his sunglasses. "Step aside, Mr. Kane. We have a long drive back." Elliot looked at his watch, 6:54. He looked at Preston one more time, and something moved through his eyes that was not anger. It was closer to the feeling a man gets when he can see exactly how the next several hours are going to unfold and understands that they cannot be shortened, only survived with some measure of dignity and tact. "You should check your logs one more time, son," he said. Preston did not check. He tapped the acknowledge button on his tablet with the authority of someone who has not yet been required to live with the downstream consequences of a wrong decision made at speed. "Dale, hook it up. If he interferes, call the sheriff. We have the court order." Dale had already disappeared into the barn. A moment later, the Titan 9500's 13-liter diesel engine tore through the quiet of the valley like a crack in glass. Inside the barn, Dale worked the way he always worked, quickly and without unnecessary motion. He found the machine in the first stall, backed against the far wall, clean and greased. He brought it to life and guided it out into the morning sun, and the red paint caught the light, still faintly dusty from the previous season's work. And as the machine crossed the threshold of the barn and into the open air, Dale glanced once toward the porch. The woman was standing in the doorway of the house. She had come out at some point without his noticing. She was not old exactly, but she was diminished in a specific way that Dale recognized from watching his own mother in the final years, too thin across the shoulders, moving with too much intention, as if each step required a small private decision. She stood in the doorway and watched him bring the machine out of the barn, and she did not say anything at all. Dale looked away first. He turned back to the work and checked a chain fitting that did not need checking, just to have somewhere else to put his eyes. On the porch, Elliot watched Dale back the Titan 9500 onto the trailer with the practiced ease of long experience. He watched the grade 70 chains go taut across the frame. He listened to the ratchets tighten one by one, each click, measuring out the distance between what he had built and what was being taken. Preston walked back to the truck. He stopped near the driver's door and looked at Elliot one final time. He wanted something. A raised voice, a threat, a reason to feel like the reasonable party in a confrontation. Elliot gave him nothing. "Have a safe drive," Elliot said. The GMC strained under the weight of the trailer as it turned in the yard and moved back up the gravel drive. Elliot watched the taillights disappear around the first bend of the creek. The dust they left behind hung in the still morning air. Then the meadowlark started up again, as if the interruption had simply been a longer than usual pause between verses. Elliot set his coffee mug down. He went inside. He did not call the police. He did not call the dealership. He walked to the parlor and picked up the rotary phone on his desk and dialed a number he had known for 30 years without needing to look it up. "Walter." Flat and quiet. They took it. 647. Man named Preston Harlow. Send the signal. He set the receiver down. He opened the wooden box and took out the carbon copy of the wire transfer. He held it without reading it. He knew what it said. He placed it on the desk next to the leather-bound ledger that contained 50 years of operating costs for this farm, recorded in his own handwriting, in columns that had never needed correction. 2 documents, paper and ink, against whatever a database in Denver said. He went back to the porch. He sat in the rocker. He picked up the piece of cedar he had been carving in the evenings, a small bird that was beginning to take shape, and he continued. The shavings fell onto the porch boards, pale and weightless, barely making a sound. The silence that had returned to Millstone Valley after the truck left was not the silence that had been there before the truck arrived. Before it had been the silence of a morning at rest. What settled over the valley now was different. It was the silence that comes before something shifts beneath the surface, before the creek rises without any visible rain, before the cattle start moving to higher ground for reasons older than any language. At 10:32, the phone rang. Elliot came in from the porch and lifted the receiver. The voice on the other end was young and female and carefully neutral in the way of people trained to deliver difficult information without accepting any share of its weight. She identified herself as calling from Vanguard Apex Industrial Customer Operations, and she informed him that Unit Apex Titan 9500 had been successfully recovered that morning, pursuant to Section 14B of his financing agreement, and she asked if he had any questions about the process. Elliot stood at the kitchen counter and held the phone and looked out the window at the north field. 500 acres of corn standing gold in the morning light, ready to come in, and a storm with a 44-hour clock already running. He held the word successfully in his mind for a moment and turned it over the way you turn over a stone that looks ordinary until the underside shows what it has been hiding. Something moved through him then, something he very rarely allowed to move freely. It came up from somewhere below his sternum, sharp and hot, the specific anger of a man who has done everything right and been handled as though he had done everything wrong. He thought about Nora standing in the doorway this morning watching. He thought about the October invoice on the kitchen table. He thought about $34,000 in 17 hours and a hailstorm that did not care about anyone's payment history. He could feel all of it rising, looking for a way out. He did not let it out. Not from fear, not from strategy in the narrow sense. He let it go because he had learned from this land and from his father, and from 50 years of watching what became of men who let their anger speak before their preparation did. The angry man makes a speech. The prepared man makes history. He had been preparing since Friday in ways that Preston Harlow and the woman who had sent him did not yet understand. "Thank you for calling," he said. He hung up. He stood at the counter and breathed. Then he picked up the phone again and called Owen. "Owen, Harrow Creek Bridge, bring the case." He hung up, went back to the porch, picked up his cedar bird, and continued carving. In a glass and steel office building in Denver, Sandra Pruitt had made her decision 5 days ago and had not thought about it since. She was 58 years old, and she had been Regional Vice President of Credit Operations for Vanguard, Apex Industrial for 11 years. She was not a cruel woman. She was a precise one. She kept a whiteboard in her office with her team's quarterly recovery numbers updated in real time, and she reviewed it each morning with the particular satisfaction of someone who has found a language they are genuinely fluent in and intends to remain so. The wire transfer confirmation had arrived in her inbox on Friday afternoon at 3:12. She had read it at her desk while finishing the last of her coffee. Payment received transaction code V, a 99982CH account, VC, 4417, Kane Elliott, Millstone Valley, Montana. Final balloon installment. Case closed. She had set down the coffee. She had opened the file. The balloon payment had been 92 days past its due date when the wire cleared. Under the terms of the financing agreement, a payment received after 60 days past the balloon date triggered a late processing fee of $4,200. An additional expedited recovery penalty of $8,500 applied only if a formal recovery order had been initiated prior to confirmation of payment. No recovery order had been initiated because no one had pulled the Kane file until Sandra pulled it on Thursday, working through a list of accounts that might close out the quarter's revenue shortfall. Her team was running $63,000 short of target. $12,700 was not trivial in that context. She had typed the dispatch order herself. Midnight Monday, she had selected the checkbox marked "Do not notify payment status change to client prior to unit recovery." She had forwarded the assignment to Preston Harlow with a note that said, "Only high priority. Denver office interest." She had driven home at 5:30. She had eaten dinner with her husband and watched an hour of television and gone to bed and slept without interruption. The name Millstone Valley had not entered her mind between Friday afternoon and Monday morning. This was not unusual. There were a lot of accounts. There were a lot of files. 800 meters down County Road 14 from the Kane property, Roy Slade had been watching since before 6 o'clock. Roy was 55 years old. He had spent 20 years as a county deputy sheriff for a matter involving a construction firm's political contributions, and an arrangement that existed in the space between discretion and corruption had cost him his badge. He was not proud of that chapter. He had spent the 15 years since doing the work that people needed done, but preferred not to discuss by name. Asset location, skip tracing, surveillance. The occasional errand that lived in the territory between legal and inadvisable. Sandra Pruitt had called him on Sunday evening through a referral from a mortgage enforcement firm in Salt Lake City. The instructions had been simple. Watch the Kane property. If the subject made contact with anyone capable of delaying the recovery vehicle's exit from the county before it reached the county line, call immediately. Roy had been given Preston Harlow's route and timetable. He had watched the GMC come in at 6:47. He had watched it leave with the tractor chained to the trailer 20 minutes later. Through his binoculars, he had seen the woman in the doorway of the house standing very still as the machine came out of the barn. He called Sandra. Vehicle has the unit and is en route. The subject went inside after departure. No visible outside contacts, no one leaving the property. Good. Her voice was efficient, clipped. Stay on it. If he reaches anyone who could slow that truck between here and the county line, I need to know immediately. Roy lowered the binoculars. He looked at his notepad. He had written the time the truck arrived, the time it left, and the phrase, "do not notify payment status change," which Sandra had mentioned during the briefing on Sunday night, reading it aloud from the dispatch notes, as if reciting a policy rather than a decision she had made herself. Sandra, he said, is the payment actually overdue? 2 seconds of silence. In Roy's experience, an honest answer to a simple, factual question did not take 2 seconds. That's not relevant to your assignment, Roy. He looked at his notepad. He uncapped his pen. He wrote the time and the date and Sandra's exact words. He did not cap the pen when he was done. Copy that, he said. He started the Explorer and pulled out onto County Road 14, keeping the dust cloud from the GMC visible a quarter-mile ahead. The morning had gone fully bright. On both sides of the road, the corn of Millstone Valley stood gold and dry and ready, and the sky above it was the deep, uncomplicated blue of a September morning that had not yet decided what it was going to become. Preston Harlow had been driving for 11 minutes when Sandra Pruitt called. He had the windows up and the air conditioning running and the radio off, and the weight of the Titan 9500 on the trailer behind him was the most satisfying physical sensation he had experienced in months. $500,000 of secured asset recovered and en route. He had been rehearsing the call to the Denver office in his head, the precise tone of professional understatement he intended to use when he reported the successful completion. He was thinking about the corner office. He was thinking about what his father would say if he knew. His phone lit up on the dash mount. Sandra Pruitt. He answered it on the second ring. It's done. We have the unit. We're on 14 heading toward the county line. Good. Her voice was flat in the way it got when she was processing several things at once. Listen carefully. Do not stop for any reason between your current position and the highway. If someone tries to give you paperwork, do not accept it. If anyone mentions a payment, do not engage. Just keep driving. Preston adjusted his grip on the wheel. Sandra, what are you not telling me? I'm telling you everything you need to know to do your job. That's not the same thing. 2 seconds of quiet. Just get the unit to the county line, Preston. I'll handle the rest from here. She ended the call. Preston looked at the road ahead. County Road 14 ran straight through the valley between walls of standing corn, and the morning light was hitting it at an angle that made the asphalt look like hammered copper. He checked the mirrors. The trailer was riding level, the chains holding their tension. Everything was exactly as it should be. In the passenger seat, Dale had been looking out the window since they left the property. He had not spoken since the barn. She tell you something she didn't tell me? Preston asked. Dale turned from the window. He looked at Preston for a long moment with the expression of a man choosing between honesty and quiet, and choosing honesty because quiet had already cost him enough. That woman in the doorway, at the house. I saw her. She was sick. Dale said it the way he said most things, directly and without decoration. Not sick like a cold, the other kind. Preston said nothing. I've done 263 of these, Dale said. You want to know how many times I've seen a farm this well maintained go into default on a payment that was this close to the end of the loan? Preston kept his eyes on the road. Twice, Dale said. Both times the payment had been made and the paperwork hadn't caught up. He turned back to the window. I'm just saying what I'm saying. The corn on both sides of the road thinned, and then the road curved left toward the creek, and Preston saw the bridge. Harrow Creek Bridge was a single-lane structure from the early 1950s, concrete pillars and a deck just wide enough for 2 normal vehicles to pass with care. For a truck pulling a wide-load trailer, it required the oncoming lane to be clear. The road narrowed at the approach, and the oak trees on both sides extended their branches over the creek below. Sitting squarely in the middle of the bridge, engine idling, was a John Deere 8R. The tractor was green where it was not rust and mud, and the mud on its tires was the dark specific color of the valley floor, the kind that builds up over seasons and becomes part of the machine. Behind the glass of the cab, a man was reading a newspaper. Preston leaned on the horn, a long, flat blast that rolled across the water and came back to him from the tree line. The man in the cab turned a page. Preston hit the horn again, 2 short punches this time. Nothing. He pulled to a stop at the bridge approach, set the parking brake, and got out. The morning air hit him differently outside the truck, Fuller carrying the creek and the corn, and something else he could not name. He walked to the bridge, his boots loud on the concrete, and came up alongside the John Deere. Walter Briggs was 72 years old, and he had the kind of beard that looks like it was grown by weather rather than intention. His oil-stained cap had the shape of something that had been sat on many times and returned to the head without ceremony. His reading glasses were perched low on his nose, and he was studying the Millstone Valley Gazette with the attention of a man reading a document that contained information he intended to act on. "Move the rig," Preston said. "I'm carrying a legal recovery order, and I have a schedule." Walter lowered the paper by 2 inches and looked at Preston over the tops of his glasses. His eyes were the pale gray blue of November sky, unhurried and absolutely steady. "Engine stalled," he said. "I can hear it running." Walter reached down and turned the key. The engine died. The bridge went quiet except for the sound of the creek below. "Now it's stalled," he said. Preston felt the heat come up through his collar. "That is obstruction of a lawful repossession. I have a court order in that truck. You are committing a felony." Walter said and raised his newspaper back to reading position. Preston reached for his phone. No signal. Not one bar. He held it up and turned in a slow circle on the bridge deck and got nothing from any direction. Harrow Creek Bridge sat in a cut between 2 limestone ridges, and whatever the cell towers on the valley floor could reach this particular pocket was not among them. He was still turning when he heard the engine behind him. He turned to look back at his truck, and what he saw stopped him, the way a man stops when he steps into a room and realizes it is not the room he thought it was. 6 feet behind his trailer, close enough that he could have laid his hand on the front grille without fully extending his arm, a red International Harvester case had come to a stop. The young man behind the wheel looked at Preston through the glass with an expression that was not threatening and not friendly. It was simply present, certain, the expression of someone who had decided something earlier in the day and was not reconsidering it now. Owen Kane. Then a second tractor came up on the right shoulder of the road, a weathered Massey Ferguson, that moved onto the approach at an angle that blocked the ditch. Then a third, an old Ford from the early 1960s, its hood the color of faded brick, its engine running with a smoothness that only comes from decades of meticulous care. Then 2 more came from the direction of the creek and 2 more behind them, and within 10 minutes of the moment Preston had stepped out of his truck, 12 tractors occupied every available exit from Harrow Creek Bridge. They were not parked randomly. They were positioned. The gaps between them were calculated, the angles deliberate. Preston had studied enough logistics to recognize a formation when he saw one, and what he saw was a formation. Not a protest, not a crowd, a seal. He stood on the bridge and looked at all of it and felt something he had not felt in a professional context since the first week of his first job. He felt out of his depth. "What is this?" he said to nobody in particular because there was nobody in particular to say it to. Every cab was closed. Every engine was running. Nobody was looking at him. He walked back to his truck. Dale had gotten out and was standing on the running board looking at the assembled machinery with the calm of a man who has seen enough versions of a situation to recognize this one. "You grew up in a place like this," Preston said. "Smaller," Dale said. "Then you know what this is." Dale stepped down from the running board. He looked at the IH case behind the trailer, at Owen Kane sitting motionless behind the glass. "I know what it is," he said. "I also know it doesn't happen unless someone is very sure of something." Preston turned to look at Owen. The young man had not moved. Preston walked to the cab and knocked on the glass. Owen lowered the window 4 inches. "You're obstructing a court-ordered recovery," Preston said. "That is a criminal offense. Every man here is looking at charges." Owen looked at him. Not through him, not past him. At him with a specificity that was more uncomfortable than anger would have been. "Ask your company about transaction code VA-99982-CH, he said. "Ask them what time the confirmation was time-stamped." Preston went very still. Where did you get that number? Owen raised the window. Preston stood there for a moment. Then he walked back to Dale. He knew the transaction code. Dale said nothing. How does a 25-year-old farmer in the middle of Montana know the internal transaction code on a corporate wire transfer? Dale looked at the ground. Because his uncle told him, and his uncle knows because his uncle made the payment 5 days ago. He met Preston's eyes. And if he knows the transaction code, then the payment was real. And if the payment was real, then we are standing on this bridge with $500,000 of that man's equipment on our trailer. And there is no version of this that ends well for you and me. Preston turned away. He walked to the end of the bridge and held his phone up toward the gap in the tree canopy overhead and watched the screen for any sign of a signal. Nothing. He was standing on a concrete bridge over a creek in a valley he had never been to before this morning, surrounded by equipment that outweighed his entire operation by a factor he did not want to calculate, with a single bar of cellular service somewhere between his current location and the highway that might as well have been on the moon. He sat down on the bridge railing. The concrete was warm from the morning sun. He looked at the cornfields that ran up both sides of the valley toward the tree line, gold and dry and ready, and he thought about Sandra's voice on the phone. Do not engage. Just keep driving. He thought about the way she had said it, the specific flatness of it, the tone of someone managing a situation rather than reporting a fact. He thought about his father's voice saying, "You never get your hands dirty, do you?" He had been sitting there for 40 minutes when he heard the car. It came from the direction of the Kane property, moving at the measured pace of something that had no reason to hurry. A black European sedan, its paint throwing back the sunlight without any of the road dust that coated everything else on County Road 14. It stopped at the edge of the tractor formation, and a man got out. Theodore Marsh was 80 years old. He wore a three-piece wool suit the color of charcoal, and he moved with the unhurried precision of someone for whom the world had long since stopped being able to surprise him into carelessness. His leather briefcase was scuffed at the corners in the way that comes from decades of being carried into rooms where things were decided. He did not look at the tractors. He did not look at Preston. He looked at his watch. 12:18, he said quietly to himself, as if confirming something. Preston got to his feet. He had heard the name Theodore Marsh twice in his professional life, once from a regional manager in Seattle who had said it the way you say the name of weather, and once from Sandra herself in a context he now could not remember but suddenly wanted to. He walked toward the old man. Are you the attorney? Preston said. Because these people are committing multiple felonies, and I need them cleared from this road. Marsh did not look at him immediately. He set his briefcase on the hood of the sedan and opened it with the unhurried motion of a man who had opened it 10,000 times. My name is Theodore Marsh, he said. I represent Mr. Elliot Kane. I have here an emergency stay of execution and a temporary restraining order signed by Judge Harold Carpenter of the Third Circuit Court at 10:47 this morning. He withdrew a single sheet of blue legal bond paper and extended it to Preston without drama. Preston took it. He looked at the header. He looked at the judge's signature. He looked at the filing time. I have a primary recovery order issued by Vanguard Apex Industrial, Marsh said, based on a payment status that was incorrect at the time the order was issued and has been documented as incorrect since Friday afternoon of last week. He reached into the briefcase again. The wire transfer was confirmed at 3:12 on Friday. Vanguard Apex's own credit operations department received the confirmation at that time. He placed a bank confirmation on the hood of the sedan with a timestamp clearly visible at the top of the page. Then he placed a second document beside it. Preston looked at the second document. It was a printed email. The sender field showed a Vanguard Apex corporate address. The recipient was the Repoed dispatch team. The subject line read, Dispatch Kane, do not notify payment status, change to client prior to unit recovery. The timestamp was 11:47 on Monday night. The name in the sender field was Sandra Pruitt. The bridge went very quiet. Preston read the email 3 times. He read it the way a man reads something that is rearranging the furniture of a room he thought he knew. He read the subject line again. Do not notify payment status change. Not a system flag. Not an automated hold. A manual instruction written by a person who knew the payment had cleared and chose to proceed anyway. She knew, Preston said. It came out quieter than he intended. Your company acknowledged receipt of the payment at 3:12 on Friday, Marsh said. The dispatch order was issued at 11:47 on Monday night. The intervening period was sufficient for 17 separate internal notifications to have been sent to the client. None were sent. Marsh closed his briefcase. You were not given accurate information before you came here this morning, Mr. Harlow. That is a fact I intend to make very clear in the proceedings. Preston looked at the email. He looked at the blue restraining order in his other hand. He looked at the tractors arranged around his truck with the implacable patience of things that had been doing hard work long before he arrived and would continue doing it long after he left. He looked at Owen Kane behind the glass of the IH case, still not moving, still watching. Then he heard his name from the direction of the truck. Dale was standing by the passenger door holding his phone up at arm's length toward the sky. Preston. His voice had a quality that Preston had not heard in it before. I got one bar for about 4 seconds. There's a text from corporate. He lowered the phone and read from the screen. Recovery order VC 4417 rescinded as of 1100 hours today. Release unit immediately. Exit Millstone County without delay. Nobody said anything. The creek made its sound below the bridge. Somewhere in the corn, a red-tailed hawk called once and went silent. Preston looked at this timestamp on the corporate text. 1100 hours, an hour ago. They had rescinded the order an hour ago while he was standing on this bridge with no signal, while the Titan 9500 sat chained to his trailer 20 feet away. They had rescinded it and said nothing to him until a single bar of cellular service found Dale's phone for 4 seconds over a limestone ridge. He turned and looked at Elliot Kane. Elliot had come up beside Marsh at some point in the last few minutes quietly, and without drawing attention to himself, the way a man moves on his own land when he wants to observe without being observed. He was still holding his coffee mug, the one with the chip and the hairline crack. He looked at Preston with the expression that had been on his face since 6:47 that morning, the one that contained no anger, no triumph, nothing that could be pointed to and called an emotion in the ordinary sense. It was the expression of a man who had been right about everything and had taken no particular pleasure in the confirmation. I didn't know, Preston said. He meant it as something, though he could not have said exactly what. You didn't check, Elliot said. It was 4 words. It was the whole case, the entire argument, the full weight of the morning compressed into the simple arithmetic of what a man had and had not done before he drove 2 hours into someone else's valley and reached into someone else's barn. Preston turned away. Dale, unhook it. What followed was 20 minutes of controlled noise. The ratchets releasing each click a reversal of the sound that had started the morning. The hiss of the air brake system, the groan of the trailer deck adjusting to the change in load. The Titan 9500's engine coming to life again, and the sound of its tires on the bridge gravel as it rolled backward off the trailer and onto solid ground. Preston sat in the cab of the GMC and waited. He did not turn on the air conditioning. The cab heated up steadily in the late morning sun, and he sat in the heat and looked through the windshield at Walter Briggs, who had raised his newspaper again and was reading as though none of this had happened or was happening. Owen's voice came from somewhere outside, engines still stalled. Preston put his forehead briefly against the steering wheel. He sat back up. He waited. He had been sitting there for 17 minutes, the cab by now holding the accumulated heat of a Montana September morning, with no relief when Elliot nodded from the shoulder of the road. Walter Briggs folded his newspaper with the deliberateness of a man completing a task that deserved to be finished properly. He turned the key. The John Deere came back to life with a sound like authority resuming its natural position. Walter backed it off the bridge deck slowly, no hurry clearing the lane by whatever margin he considered sufficient. One by one, the 12 tractors disengaged. They pulled back to the road shoulders and the field approaches and turned toward their own properties. No horns, no voices, no acknowledgement of what had just taken place. They simply went back to work the way men go back to work when the thing that needed doing has been done. Preston put the GMC in gear and moved across the bridge. The tires crossed the old concrete and hit the gravel on the far side, and he gave the engine more fuel than it needed, and the truck pulled away fast, and the dust it raised was still hanging over Harrow Creek when the sound of the engine had faded entirely. From the shoulder of the road, 200 meters back, Roy Slade had watched all of it. He had watched the tractors form up. He had watched Preston's isolated pacing on the bridge. He had watched Theodore Marsh arrive and open his briefcase, and he had watched the moment Preston read the email, because that moment had a shape to it that Roy recognized from 20 years of watching people absorb information they were not prepared for. He had watched Elliot Kane stand beside his lawyer and say 4 words that landed harder than anything Marsh had said. He had also watched Owen Kane halfway through the standoff turn and look directly at Roy's Explorer. Not searching, not surprised, simply acknowledging a presence he had already identified and cataloged. Roy picked up his phone. He called Sandra. "It's over," he said. "They released the unit. Marsh was here." He had the email Sandra, the dispatch email, the subject line. The silence on her end was longer this time. "How did Marsh get that email?" she said. "I don't know, but he had it." He read the subject line aloud on the bridge in front of 12 witnesses. Roy paused. "I need you to understand what I'm telling you." 12 men heard that subject line read aloud. One of them is an 80-year-old attorney who has been practicing in this circuit since before some of these men were born. Another silence. "Thank you, Roy," Sandra said. Her voice had changed. The professional flatness was still there, but something had gone out of it, some underlying current of control that had been present in every previous conversation. "I'll be in touch." She ended the call. Roy set the phone on the passenger seat. He looked at his notepad, 3 pages now, times and dates and direct quotes. He looked through the windshield at the empty bridge, the creek still moving underneath it, the corn on both sides of the road still standing gold and ready in the late morning light. He picked up the pen. He wrote one more line. Then he picked up the phone again and dialed a different number. Not Sandra's, not his referral contact in Salt Lake City. He waited through 4 rings. "Marsh," said the voice on the other end. "This is Roy Slade," Roy said. "I've been on this property since 6 o'clock this morning working for Sandra Pruitt. I have 3 pages of notes, and I think you're going to want to see them." He paused. "I can be at the Kane property in 20 minutes. The Titan 9500 came off the bridge and onto the gravel of County Road 14, and Elliot guided it with the same hands that had been guiding machines on this land for 50 years. The engine spoke through the frame and into the soles of his boots, and he let it speak. He did not go back to the house. He went north toward the field because there was still time, and the storm did not care about what had happened on the bridge this morning, and the corn did not care, and the arithmetic of the harvest did not adjust itself for a man's troubles. 1:45 in the afternoon, 22 and a half hours remaining. He made the first pass along the north edge of the field, and the header swept the standing corn down in a clean, continuous motion, and the grain moved up through the machine and into the hopper, and the sound of it was the most honest sound Elliot Kane knew. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just the sound of work continuing after the interruption has ended, which is its own kind of statement. Owen had brought the supplemental machine around from the east approach and fell in behind his uncle at a distance that kept their paths parallel without overlapping. He had learned that rhythm from Elliot when he was still a teenager, the way you learn things from a person who teaches by doing rather than by explaining. The 2 machines moved through the north field like the hands of a clock that had been stopped and was now running again. Marsh had gone. His sedan had turned around at the property line and headed back toward Billings without ceremony, though not before he and Elliot had stood for 3 minutes near the barn and spoken quietly about what came next. The restraining order was in place. The recovery order was rescinded. The tort claim was already drafted and filed with the circuit court, and Marsh had said the words 6 figures at minimum, with the flat certainty of a man quoting a price he has quoted before and been right about. Elliot had said he did not want their money. Marsh had said he knew. He had also said what he said every time Elliot said that, which was that refusing the settlement did not punish the company, it only freed them from the lesson. And Elliot had said what he always said when Marsh said that which was nothing, because Marsh was right, and Elliot had never found a satisfying argument against a thing that was simply true. "The Grange," Elliot had said finally. "The school lunch program," Marsh had said, as if completing the sentence rather than hearing it for the first time. 3 years of it, if it's enough. Marsh had picked up his briefcase. "I'll take my fee from their corporate travel budget." He had walked to his car without looking back, and Elliot had watched him go, and then he had climbed the steps of the Titan 9500 and driven it toward the field. At the farmhouse, Nora came out onto the porch at 2 o'clock and sat in the rocker that Elliot had vacated that morning. The cedar bird was still on the arm of the chair, where he had left it half finished, the knife beside it. She did not pick them up. She looked out at the north field and watched the two machines moving through the corn, and she put her hand flat against her sternum in the way she had developed over the past 6 months, a gesture so habitual now that she no longer noticed she was doing it. Walter Briggs pulled his truck into the yard at 2:15. He came up the porch steps and sat in the second chair without being invited, because he had been coming to this porch for 30 years and the invitation was understood to be permanent. He was still wearing the oil-stained cap. He had a thermos of coffee, and he poured 2 cups and handed one to Nora, and set his on the railing and looked out at the field. They sat that way for a while. "He didn't call you," Nora said. It was not a question. "Owen called me," Walter said. 6:58 this morning. He said his uncle needed help and wouldn't say so himself." He took a sip of coffee. "The boy called the other 11 too. Every one of them." Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the field at the two machines she could just make out through the haze of chaff and afternoon light. "Elliot thinks he's protecting us when he carries things alone," she said. "He's been doing it for 40 years. You carry it alone so nobody else has to feel the weight." "Works sometimes," Walter said. "It works until it doesn't." She set her coffee on the arm of the chair. "Owen understands something that took me 15 years to learn. You don't wait for a man like Elliot to ask, you just show up." Walter nodded slowly. He looked at the field. "Elliot know the boy made those calls." "He knows now," Nora said. "He'll never say anything about it directly." "No," Walter agreed. "He won't." They sat with them, and the afternoon moved around them, and in the north field, the Titan 9500 continued its steady work. Roy Slade arrived at the property at 2:40. He drove the gray Explorer up the driveway and parked it in the open, not on the road margin where he had spent the morning, and he got out with his cap in his hand. Owen was coming across the yard from the direction of the bins when Roy pulled in, and he stopped and looked at the car and then at Roy, and he did not move to close the distance. Roy stopped at the edge of the yard. "I already talked to Marsh," he said. "I gave him the notes. 3 pages, everything I recorded from this morning, including the exact language Sandra Pruitt used when she told me the payment status wasn't my concern." He paused. "I wanted you to know that directly, not through the attorney." Owen looked at him for a long time. "Why?" Roy turned the cap at his hands. It was a working man's gesture, the hands needing something to do while the mind worked out what the mouth should say. "Because I sat in that car for 6 hours this morning, watching an old man get something taken from him that was already his, and I didn't do anything about it until it was convenient for me to do something about it." He met Owen's eyes. "That's not a thing I'm going to feel good about, whatever happens in the lawsuit, but it's what I did. I figured you deserved to hear me say that out loud." Owen was still for a moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the porch. "My aunt is up there." Roy shook his head. "I didn't come to talk to the family. I came to say that to you. You're the one who made me while I was sitting on the road this morning. You didn't have to let it go at the bridge." He put his cap back on. "I'll testify if Marsh needs it. Voluntarily, no subpoena." He turned back toward the Explorer. Owen watched him go. "Slade," Owen said. Roy stopped. "You wrote it down," Owen said. "From the beginning, before you knew how it was going to turn out." Roy looked at the notebook in his breast pocket, the corner of it visible above the flannel. He did not say anything. "That matters," Owen said. "Not everything, but it matters." Roy got in the Explorer and drove out. Owen stood in the yard and watched the dust from the tires settle, and then he went back to work. In Denver, the meeting in Sandra Pruitt's office had begun at 2 o'clock and had not gone the way she anticipated. The CFO sat across from her at the conference table, and beside him was the company's head of legal compliance and a woman from the audit division whom Sandra had met only once before. On the table between them was a printed copy of the email she had sent Monday night, the one with the subject line. She had not expected Marsh to have it by this morning, which meant someone in the system had pulled it, which meant the corporate risk team had been watching the Kane file since before the restraining order was filed. The CFO was a patient man who chose his words the way a carpenter chooses wood for grain and weight, and how they would hold under pressure. "Sandra," he said, "we need to understand the decision-making process that led to this dispatch order." Sandra looked at the email on the table. She had written it in 4 minutes on a Monday night after a phone call with her quarterly review committee. She had not thought about it again until Roy's call this morning. $12,700. She could see the figure now, with a clarity that had not been available to her last Friday, the way you see a small thing clearly, only after it has produced a very large shadow. I made a judgment call, she said. Based on what information? The compliance officer asked. Based on the account status at the time of the order. The account status that included a confirmed wire transfer receipt timestamped 3/12 Friday afternoon. Sandra did not answer. The damages calculation from opposing counsel is currently sitting at $185,000, the COO said. That's the opening position. Marsh doesn't open low. He folded his hands on the table. And there is the matter of the notes taken by the surveillance contractor, which have been submitted as part of the evidentiary record, in which document your specific instruction to withhold payment notification. Sandra looked at the window. The Denver afternoon was clear and bright, the mountains visible to the west, in the kind of sharp relief that only comes when the air is dry and the light is right. She had grown up in this city. She had built her career in this city. She understood systems, and she understood that she was now inside one that was processing her, the same way she had processed files for 11 years, as a set of facts to be weighed and a decision to be made. What is the company's position, she asked. The company's position, the CFO said carefully, is that we settle promptly, and we do whatever is required to ensure that this particular sequence of events does not repeat itself under any circumstances. He paused. And we will need to discuss your role going forward. Sandra nodded. She did not argue. There was nothing to argue with. The arithmetic was the arithmetic. 3 weeks after the storm. The hail had arrived at 3 in the morning, 2 hours ahead of the revised forecast, which meant it had arrived 22 hours after Elliot started the harvest, which meant he had 81 acres in the bin when the first stones hit the roof of the farmhouse. He had been sitting at the kitchen table when it came Nora asleep against his shoulder, the coffee in front of him gone cold. He had listened to the hail come down on the metal roof of the barn, in the house, and the grain bins, a sound like something being built rather than destroyed, and he had felt the particular peace of a man who has done the work that needed to be done and is now simply waiting for the weather to finish its business. The corn on the remaining 419 acres was damaged. The stalks were broken, and the ears that had not been harvested were split and scattered. He had known it would be. He had done the insurance calculation before the storm and accepted the result. The 81 acres in the bin were enough, combined with the settlement that Marsh had called about on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks later, to carry the farm through winter and pay the October invoice in full with something left over. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday. The courier drove a white sedan, not a truck, and he left the envelope with Nora at the front door and drove away without requiring a signature. Nora brought it to the kitchen table where Elliot was eating breakfast, and she set it down beside his plate and sat across from him and waited. He opened it. A letter from the CEO of Vanguard Apex Industrial, 3 paragraphs of corporate language that worked very hard to express remorse without quite locating the specific decision that had required remorsing. He read the first paragraph and folded it and set it aside. The check was behind it. He looked at the number. $185,000. He looked at it for a while. Grange, Nora said, because she already knew. 3 years, Elliot said. Maybe 4 if Marsh left anything after his fee. He said he took it from their travel budget. Elliot set the check on the table. He looked at his wife across the kitchen that had not changed in 30 years. The same curtains, the same cast iron skillet hanging beside the stove, the same table where they had eaten every meal and made every major decision and sat through every hard winter since the year they were married. Nora's hair was coming back in now, soft and close to her head, and her color was better than it had been in September, and she was looking at him with an expression he knew as well as he knew any feature of this land. Patient, certain. The expression of a woman who has been right about a man for 42 years and intends to remain so. I don't need their money, he said. It came out softer than he intended. I know, she said, but those kids need lunch. She pushed the check back toward him. Take it to the Grange this afternoon. I'll call ahead. He folded the check and put it in his shirt pocket. He finished his breakfast. Preston Harlow called the landline at 10 o'clock that same morning. Elliot was in the barn running a diagnostic on the Titan 9500 when the phone rang and Nora answered it in the kitchen. She came to the barn door and told him who it was, and Elliot wiped his hands on a rag and went inside. He picked up the phone. Kane, The voice on the other end was Preston's, but it was not the voice that had stood at the base of the porch steps on a September morning and said that red means I take the keys. Something had gone out of it, not confidence exactly, more like the particular kind of certainty that comes from not having been tested yet, and that leaves a man's voice when the test has come and gone, and he has understood what it cost. Mr. Kane, Preston said, I want you to know that I didn't have accurate information when I came to your property. I want to say that clearly, not through a lawyer, not in a deposition, to you directly. Elliot stood at the kitchen counter. He looked out the window at the north field, at the bare stubble of the harvested ground and the broken stalks of what the storm had taken. He thought about what to say and took his time with it. I believe you didn't know, Elliot said. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. No, Preston said, it doesn't. A silence settled between them across the phone line, the kind that is not hostile and not comfortable, but is honest, which is sometimes the most that can be asked of a silence between two people who have no particular reason to understand each other. I've been looking into it, Preston said. The pattern, the accounts. Yours wasn't the first time a payment was received, and a dispatch went out anyway. I found 11 others going back 2 years. Elliot said nothing. I don't know what I'm going to do with that yet, Preston said, but I wanted you to know that I found it, that I looked. Elliot turned the rag in his hands. He thought about a thing his father had told him once standing in this kitchen after a neighboring farmer had done something that could not be undone and had later come to apologize. His father had said that the apology does not undo the thing, but it tells you something about whether the person has changed their angle of approach to the world. That was worth something, his father said. Not everything, but something. There's a lawyer in Billings named Marsh, Elliot said. If you decide you want to do something with what you found, he'll know who to point you toward. Another silence, then Preston said, thank you. It was 2 words that meant more than 2 words. After the call, Elliot stood in the kitchen for a moment. He looked at the wooden box on the roll-top desk, the corner of the carbon copy still visible where he had left it 3 weeks ago. He picked up the copy and held it once more, then placed it back in the box and closed the lid. It had done its job. It could rest. He drove to the Grange that afternoon in the 1994 Ford down County Road, 14 over Harrow Creek Bridge through the valley that was quieter now with the corn gone and the fields resting in their stripped and patient way. He parked in the Grange lot and went inside and handed the envelope to Margaret Holloway, who ran the school lunch program and had been running it since before Owen was born, and she opened it and looked at the check and looked at Elliot and started to say something. Don't, Elliot said not unkindly. Margaret closed her mouth. She nodded. She put the check in the deposit envelope she kept in her desk drawer and said that the kids would have good lunches for a long time, and Elliot said that was the idea, and then he drove back to the farm. Owen was in the barn when he got back running the end-of-season maintenance on the supplemental machine. He had the side panel open and was checking the belts with the methodical attention that Elliot had taught him when he was 12 years old, feeling for wear by hand because the hand knows things that the eye can miss. He looked up when Elliot came in. Grange done, Owen asked. Done, Elliot said. Owen turned back to the belts. He worked for a moment in silence. Then, without looking up, I called the neighbors that morning without telling you. I know, Elliot said. I called Walter first, then the rest. I didn't ask you because I knew you wouldn't ask them yourself. Elliot picked up a wrench from the workbench and turned it over in his hands. Not because he needed it, just to have something to hold. 11 men stopped what they were doing on the first day of harvest to park their equipment on a bridge. You know what that costs a man in a 44-hour window. Owen looked up. It costs him something he doesn't get back, Elliot said. Time in a harvest like that is money you cannot earn twice. He set the wrench down. I'm not going to say thank you because thank you is not the right word for something that big. But I want you to know that I understand what it gave me, all of them, and you. Owen held his uncle's eyes for a moment. He nodded once slowly the way the men in this valley nodded when words had reached the end of what they were equipped to carry. The West Terraces next spring, Owen said. I want to try the new hybrid seed on that ground. The root system is supposed to hold better in the clay layer. Tell me about it in April, Elliot said, when we can look at the ground. You'll listen. I always listen. I just take my time deciding. Owen smiled. It was a quick thing more in the eyes than the mouth, and it was gone almost before it arrived, but Elliot caught it. He left Owen to the maintenance and walked out of the barn into the late afternoon. The sun was dropping toward the Beartooth Range, and the light it was throwing across the valley was the long, raking light of October, the light that makes ordinary things look like they have been considered carefully before being placed. The bare fields ran in every direction, brown and gray and clean, resting the way ground rests after it has given what it had and is gathering itself for the next year's effort. He walked to the far end of the barn and looked north. The Titan 9500 stood in its stall, clean and greased, and settled its red paint, catching the last of the light through the open barn door. He had put it back himself 3 weeks ago, the day after the storm, when the fields were still wet and the sky was still clearing and the bins were full. He had parked it exactly where Dale had found it, back against the far wall, and he had stood beside it for a while in the way you stand beside something that has been through something with you, even if the something is not the kind of thing that can be discussed between a man and a machine. He stood at the barn door and looked at the machine and then at the field beyond it. The person who had written the email was no longer with Vanguard Apex Industrial. Marsh had mentioned this in the same call where he confirmed the settlement amount without elaboration, because Marsh understood that some information is complete simply by being stated. The regional manager who had reviewed and countersigned the dispatch order on Monday night was, as Marsh put it, pursuing other opportunities. The company had put a new sign outside its finance division office, under new management, as if the building itself was trying to separate from what had happened inside it. None of that changed what had happened in the valley on a September morning. It did not give back the 7 hours. It did not unhook the chains. But it meant that the next Elliot Kane, the one who did not have a carbon copy or a lawyer's phone number memorized, or 12 neighbors with tractors and the willingness to use them, might have a slightly better chance. Might, it was not certainty. It was not justice in the full sense of the word, but it was the version of justice that the world actually produces, partial and imperfect, and still worth the work of extracting it. Nora came out of the house at 5 and called his name, and he turned and went in. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, the two of them, without the radio on. Nora had made the kind of meals she made when she was feeling well enough to cook for the pleasure of it, rather than the necessity, and the kitchen smelled of it warm, in particular, the smell of a house that has been lived in with intention. They did not talk about the lawsuit or the company or the